The living room felt colder than usual that afternoon. Margaret stood near the fireplace, the same fireplace she had chosen 23 years ago, when the house was nothing but blueprints and dreams. Her hands rested gently on the mantel, fingers brushing the framed photo of her late son, Daniel. But the warmth she once felt in this home had long been replaced by something sharp, something bitter. "Margaret?" Chloe's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Margaret turned slowly. Her daughter-in-law stood in the center of the room, arms crossed, her expression a mixture of impatience and disdain. Behind her, the rest of the family sat awkwardly on the couch. Daniel's younger cousins, his aunt, even old Mrs. Pemberton from next door who had been invited for tea. They all looked down, uncomfortable, avoiding Margaret's eyes. "I think it's time we had a conversation," Chloe said, her tone clipped and rehearsed. "A real one." Margaret didn't respond. She simply waited, her face calm, her posture steady. Chloe stepped closer, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor Margaret had installed herself, board by board, during the renovation years ago. "You've been here long enough," Chloe continued, her voice rising just slightly, "and I think you've forgotten something important." Margaret's eyebrow lifted ever so slightly. "What's that, dear?" Chloe's lips curled into a thin smile, cold, triumphant. "You're just a guest here now." The words hung in the air like poison. Margaret felt the eyes of everyone in the room shift toward her, waiting for her reaction, waiting for tears, waiting for anger, waiting for her to crumble. But Margaret didn't crumble. Instead, she smiled. It wasn't a bitter smile. It wasn't sarcastic or vengeful. It was calm, knowing, the kind of smile that comes from a place deeper than hurt, a place where patience and wisdom sit quietly, waiting for their moment. "A guest," Margaret repeated, softly, almost to herself. "How interesting." Chloe blinked, momentarily thrown off by the lack of drama. She had expected tears, pleading, maybe even begging, but this quiet composure, it unnerved her. "I'm glad you understand," Chloe said quickly, trying to regain control, "so we can discuss arrangements. I've already spoken to a moving company. They can help you pack next week." "That won't be necessary," Margaret interrupted gently. "Excuse me?" Margaret turned fully now, her gaze steady and clear. "I said, that won't be necessary." She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out her phone, an old model, simple, reliable. She scrolled through her contacts with deliberate care, then pressed a name. The room fell silent, except for the faint ringing on the other end of the line. "Hello, Thomas?" "Yes, it's Margaret. I think it's time we moved forward with that conversation we had last month." Chloe's face drained of color. "Yes," Margaret continued, her eyes never leaving Chloe's. "I'd like you to review the documentation we discussed, the original deed, the conditional transfer clause, and the signatures." There was a pause. "Perfect. I'll see you tomorrow morning at 10. Margaret ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket. The silence in the room was deafening. Chloe opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her confidence, so sharp and certain just moments ago, had begun to crack. Margaret took a slow breath. her smile softening into something almost sad. She said, "You're right about one thing, Chloe. This house does teach you who you are." She turned back toward the fireplace, her fingers once again brushing the photo of Daniel, her sweet boy, gone too soon, blind to the woman he had married. "And I'm about to remind you who I am." The room remained frozen as Margaret walked past them all, her footsteps light but firm, disappearing down the hallway toward her bedroom. Behind her, Chloe stood trembling, not with anger, but with something far more dangerous, fear. Because for the first time since Daniel's death, she realized she may have underestimated the quiet women she thought she had beaten. And that smile, that knowing, patient smile, haunted her long into the night. 25 years earlier, this house didn't exist. The land did, a beautiful half-acre plot on the edge of town, overlooking a meadow that turned gold every autumn. Margaret and her late husband Robert had bought it with their savings, dreaming of the life they would build there together. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Robert passed away just 2 years after they broke ground on the foundation. A heart attack, sudden and cruel, leaving Margaret a widow at 34 with a 6-year-old son and a half-finished house she couldn't afford to complete. Everyone told her to sell. "It's too much for one woman," they said. "You'll never manage." But Margaret wasn't interested in what she couldn't do. She was interested in what she had to do for Daniel. So she worked. 2 jobs, sometimes 3. She waitressed at the diner on weekdays, cleaned offices on weekends, and took bookkeeping gigs whenever she could find them. Every paycheck went toward another beam, another window, another coat of paint. Daniel grew up on that construction site. He handed her nails when she climbed ladders. He held the flashlight while she installed light fixtures. He sat on toolboxes doing homework while she sanded floors late into the night. And on the day they finally moved in, 7 years after Robert's death, Daniel stood in the empty living room, eyes wide with wonder. "We really did it, Mom," he whispered. Margaret knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his small shoulders. "We did, sweetheart. This is ours." It wasn't just a house. It was proof that love and persistence could outlast grief, that a mother's hands could build a future even when the world said it was impossible. The years that followed were some of the happiest of Margaret's life. She and Daniel filled the house with laughter, with traditions, with warmth. Every Christmas, they decorated the mantel together. Every summer, they sat on the porch watching fireflies. Every Sunday, they cooked breakfast side by side in the kitchen Margaret had designed herself. Daniel grew into a kind, thoughtful young man. He studied hard, earned a scholarship, and eventually took over Robert's old accounting firm in town. Margaret couldn't have been prouder. And when he told her he'd met someone, a woman named Chloe from the city, Margaret's heart swelled with hope. "She's amazing, Mom," he said one evening, his eyes bright with excitement. "Smart, beautiful, ambitious. I think she's the one." Margaret smiled, squeezing his hand. "Then I can't wait to meet her." When Chloe first visited, Margaret went out of her way to make her feel welcome. She prepared Daniel's favorite meals. She set fresh flowers in the guest room. She asked Chloe about her work, her family, her dreams, genuinely wanting to know the woman her son loved. Chloe was polite, charming even. But there was something Margaret couldn't quite place, something in the way Chloe's eyes scanned the house, not with admiration, but with assessment. The way she touched the furniture, the curtains, the walls, as if measuring their worth. Still, Margaret pushed the feeling aside. She loves Daniel, Margaret told herself. That's all that matters. The wedding was beautiful, small, intimate, held in the backyard Margaret had spent years cultivating. Chloe looked stunning in her gown, and Daniel looked happier than Margaret had ever seen him. As they exchanged vows under the oak tree Robert had planted decades ago, Margaret wiped away tears of joy. This is what I worked for, she thought. This is why I built this home, so Daniel could have a life full of love. But as the months passed, small cracks began to show. Chloe started redecorating, replacing Margaret's curtains with modern blinds, swapping out the cozy furniture for sleek, minimalist pieces. At first, Margaret said nothing. It was Daniel's home too, after all. Chloe had every right to make it her own. But then the comments started. "This wallpaper is so outdated, Margaret. Do you really need all these old photos on the walls? Maybe it's time to update the kitchen. It feels so rustic." Each remark was casual, almost dismissive, but they stung. Daniel, caught between his wife and his mother, tried to smooth things over. "She's just excited to make the place feel like ours, Mom. Don't take it personally." Margaret forced a smile. "Of course, sweetheart." But deep down, a quiet ache began to grow. This house, her house, the one she had built with her own hands, the one that held every memory of Robert, of Daniel's childhood, of the life they had fought so hard to create, was slowly being erased. And Daniel, blinded by love, couldn't see it. Still, Margaret stayed silent. She told herself it was temporary, that Chloe would settle in, that things would get better. But they didn't. They only got worse. It started with the small things. The photo of Robert that used to sit on the mantel moved to a drawer. The recipe box Margaret's mother had given her, filled with handwritten cards passed down through generations, tucked away in the back of a cabinet. The rocking chair Margaret had sat in every night to read Daniel bedtime stories, sold at a yard sale Chloe organized without asking. "It was just taking up space," she said with a shrug when Margaret noticed it was gone. Margaret stood in the living room, staring at the empty corner where the chair used to be, her chest tight with something she couldn't quite name. Grief. Anger. Helplessness. "Daniel," she said quietly that evening when he came home from work, "did you know Chloe sold the rocking chair?" Daniel looked up from his phone, distracted. "Huh? Oh, yeah, she mentioned it. We needed the space for the new bookshelf. But that chair," Margaret's voice cracked. "Your father built that chair." Daniel softened slightly, guilt flickering across his face. "I know, Mom, but it's just a chair. Dad wouldn't want us clinging to things, right? He'd want us to move forward." Margaret looked at her son, her sweet, kind boy, and barely recognized him. When had he become so dismissive? When had he stopped seeing her? She wanted to argue, to fight, to remind him of every sacrifice she had made, every nail she had hammered, every sleepless night she had spent building this home for him. But she didn't, because she saw the way Chloe hovered in the doorway, watching them with a faint smile, waiting, testing. So Margaret swallowed her pain and nodded. "You're right, sweetheart. I'm sorry." Chloe's smile widened. That night, Margaret lay awake in her bedroom, the same bedroom she and Robert had shared, the one she had painted soft blue because it reminded her of the sky on their wedding day. She stared at the ceiling, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "This is my home," she thought. "I built it. I earned it. Why does it feel like I'm the one who doesn't belong?" But the worst was yet to come. One evening, a few months later, Daniel approached Margaret with a folder in his hands. He looked nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Mom, can we talk?" Margaret set down the book she'd been reading. "Of course. What's wrong?" Daniel sat beside her, opening the folder to reveal a stack of legal documents. "Chloe and I have been talking with a financial advisor, planning for the future, investments, taxes, that kind of thing." Margaret nodded, unsure where this was going. And, Daniel hesitated. "He suggested that for tax purposes, it would make more sense if the house was officially in my name. Since I'm handling the finances now and transfer the house?" Margaret's voice was quiet, careful. "Just on paper," Daniel said quickly. "It doesn't change anything. You'll still live here. It's still your home. It just makes things cleaner, legally, easier." Margaret's stomach twisted. "Easier for who?" "For all of us," Daniel said, his tone almost pleading. "Come on, Mom. You trust me, don't you?" Margaret looked at her son, her only child, the boy she had raised, the man she had sacrificed everything for. And she heard Robert's voice in her mind, clear as day. "Never sign away what you've built, Maggie, no matter who asks." But this wasn't just anyone. This was Daniel. "Of course I trust you," Margaret whispered. And with a trembling hand, she signed the papers. Daniel smiled, relief flooding his face. "Thanks, Mom. This really helps us out." He kissed her forehead and left the room, documents in hand. Margaret sat alone in the silence, staring at her hands. She didn't know it yet, but she had just signed away everything. The months that followed were a blur of slow erasure. Chloe's changes became bolder. She replaced the dining table Margaret and Robert had picked out together. She repainted the walls stark white, covering the warm yellows and soft greens Margaret had chosen. She even talked about tearing down the back porch, the porch where Margaret and Daniel had spent countless evenings watching the sunset. And through it all, Daniel said nothing. He was busy with work, distracted, distant. Margaret tried to talk to him, but every conversation ended the same way. "Mom, Chloe's just trying to make the house feel modern. It's not personal." "Mom, you're being too sensitive." "Mom, can we not do this right now?" Margaret began to feel like a ghost in her own home. She moved through the rooms quietly, trying not to take up too much space, trying not to be a burden. She started eating dinner alone in her room. She stopped decorating for the holidays. She stopped fighting. And then one rainy October night, everything shattered. Daniel was driving home from a client meeting when a truck ran a red light. The call came at 11:47 p.m. Margaret's world ended at 11:48. The funeral was small, too small for a man as kind as Daniel. Margaret stood at the graveside, numb, hollow, unable to process the reality that her son, her baby, was gone. Chloe stood beside her, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. But Margaret noticed something. The tears didn't quite reach Chloe's eyes. And when the service ended, Chloe's hand brushed Margaret's arm, not in comfort, but in something that felt almost dismissive. "We'll talk soon," Chloe murmured, "about the house." Margaret didn't respond. She couldn't, because somewhere deep inside, she already knew the worst was yet to come. 3 weeks after Daniel's funeral, Margaret knocked on Margaret's bedroom door. It was early, barely past 7 in the morning, but Chloe was already dressed, her makeup perfect, her expression businesslike. "We need to talk," she said, not waiting for an invitation before stepping inside. Margaret sat up slowly, still in her nightgown, her eyes red-rimmed from another sleepless night. "About what?" Margaret's voice was hoarse. Chloe pulled a folded document from her purse and set it on the bed. "This." Margaret stared at the paper, her heart beginning to pound. "What is it?" "The deed to the house," Chloe said simply. "It's in Daniel's name, and as his widow, it now belongs to me." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. "What are you saying?" Chloe crossed her arms, her tone cool and clinical. "I'm saying this is my house now, legally, and I've decided to sell it." "But this is my home," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "No," she said sharply. "It was your home, but you signed it over to Daniel, remember, for tax purposes. Well, now it's mine, and I want you out by the end of the month." Margaret felt the room tilt. Everything she had worked for, everything she had built, the walls she had painted, the floors she had sanded, the memories embedded in every corner of this house, all of it, ripped away in a single conversation. "You can't do this," Margaret said, trembling. "I already have." She turned toward the door, pausing only to glance back over her shoulder. "I'll have movers come next week to help you pack. Try not to take too much. You're going to need to downsize." And then she was gone. Margaret sat frozen on the bed, the document still lying in front of her. Her hand shook as she picked it up, reading the words through blurred vision. "Transfer of property. Daniel Joseph Harrington, legal owner." And at the bottom, her own signature. Neat, trusting, naive. She had signed away everything. The hours that followed were a haze of grief and disbelief. Margaret wandered through the house like a ghost, touching the walls, the furniture, the window frames, trying to hold on to something solid, something real. But everything felt like it was slipping through her fingers. That night, she sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cold cup of tea in front of her. This can't be how it ends. It can't. But what could she do? She wasn't a lawyer. She didn't have money for legal battles. She was just an old woman who had trusted her son and paid the price. She thought of Robert, of the way he used to sit in this very chair, reading the newspaper, humming softly to himself. "Never sign away what you've built, Maggie," he had said once, years ago, when a contractor had tried to pressure her into a bad deal. "Protect what's yours, always." Margaret closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry, Robert. I should have listened." But then, through the fog of her grief, a memory surfaced. A conversation, years ago. Robert, sitting at his desk, organizing paperwork. "Maggie, if anything ever happens to me, there's something you need to know. I've set up a legal protection for the house, a conditional clause. It means the property can only be transferred if both of us consent, in writing, with witnesses. It's to protect you, to make sure no one can ever take it from you." Margaret's eyes flew open. A conditional clause. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, and hurried to the small office at the back of the house, the one room Chloe hadn't touched yet. She pulled open the desk drawer where Robert used to keep his important documents. It had been years, decades. Would it still be there? Her hands fumbled through stacks of old papers, receipts, tax forms, letters. And then, at the very bottom, she found it. A legal document, yellowed with age, but still intact. Property Protection Clause, signed by Robert J. Harrington and Margaret L. Harrington. Witnessed by Thomas Caldwell, attorney at law. Margaret's breath caught. Thomas Caldwell. He was still in town, still practicing law. I had seen his name in the local paper just last month. Her hands trembling, she pulled out her phone and searched for his number. It was nearly midnight, but she didn't care. She dialed. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. "Hello?" "Thomas?" Margaret said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and hope. "It's Margaret Harrington. I need your help." There was a pause. "Margaret, it's been years. What's wrong?" "Everything," she whispered. "But I think I just found a way to fix it." She explained everything. The transfer, Daniel's death, Chloe's demands, and the document she had just found. Thomas listened in silence. When she finished, he let out a long breath. "Margaret," he said carefully, "do you still have the original deed? The one before the transfer?" "I think so. It's in the safe." "Bring it to my office tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp." "Why?" Margaret asked, her heart pounding. "What does it mean?" Thomas's voice was steady, calm, but there was a quiet fire beneath it. "It means, Margaret, that your late husband was a very smart man. And if I'm right, Chloe doesn't own this house at all." For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt something she thought she'd lost forever. Hope. The courthouse smelled of old wood and stale air. Margaret sat on the hard bench outside courtroom 3, her hands folded in her lap, her heart pounding. She thought everyone could hear it. Beside her, Thomas Caldwell reviewed his notes one last time, his expression calm and focused.
"You ready?" he asked gently. Margaret nodded, though her mouth was dry, as ready as I'll ever be.
Through the small window in the courtroom door, she could see Chloe sitting at the defense table, dressed impeccably in a navy suit, her lawyer whispering something in her ear. Chloe looked confident, unbothered, as if this were just another inconvenience she'd soon brush aside. But Margaret knew better now. She had spent the last 2 weeks with Thomas, going through every document, every signature, every clause, and what they had found was damning. The transfer of the house to Daniel had never been complete. According to the conditional clause Robert had put in place decades ago, both Robert and Margaret had to sign off on any transfer of ownership, and after Robert's death, that responsibility fell solely to Margaret. The document Daniel had asked her to sign, it wasn't a full transfer. It was a request for transfer, requiring secondary legal validation that had never been filed. In short, the house had never legally left Margaret's name. But that wasn't all. When Thomas dug deeper into the paperwork Chloe's lawyer had filed, he found something else: forged signatures. Chloe had submitted documents to the county clerk's office claiming Margaret had signed a formal relinquishment of ownership. But the signature didn't match. It was close, but not close enough. And worse, the notary stamp was fake. Thomas had traced it to a man Chloe had paid under the table, a man who had since disappeared. "This isn't just a property dispute," Thomas had told Margaret grimly. "This is fraud." Now, as the bailiff called them into the courtroom, Margaret felt a strange calm settle over her. She wasn't fighting for revenge or fighting out of bitterness. She was fighting for the truth. The judge, a stern older woman named Judge Ramirez, sat at the bench, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed the case file. "Let's keep this efficient," she said, her voice crisp. "Miss Harrington, you're alleging that the transfer of property to your late daughter-in-law was unlawful. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Margaret said steadily. "And Miss Parker, you claim legal ownership through inheritance from your late husband, correct?" Chloe smiled politely. "That's correct, Your Honor." Judge Ramirez glanced between them. "Let's hear the evidence." Thomas stood, his voice clear and measured, as he walked the court through the timeline: the original deed, the conditional clause, the incomplete transfer, the forged documents. With each piece of evidence he presented, Chloe's expression grew tighter. Her lawyer tried to interject to argue technicalities, but Thomas was prepared for every objection. And then he played his final card. "Your Honor," Thomas said, placing a document on the bench, "this is the original deed to the property signed by Robert and Margaret Harrington in 1998. As you can see, it includes a conditional protection clause validated by witness signature and county seal." He turned to Chloe. "Miss Parker's claim relies on a transfer document that was never completed and a relinquishment form that was forged." Chloe's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection. That's a baseless accusation." "It's not baseless," Thomas said calmly. He handed another file to the judge. "This is a forensic handwriting analysis comparing the signature on the relinquishment form to verified samples of Margaret Harrington's signature. The analysis confirms they do not match." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Ramirez studied the documents carefully, her expression unreadable. Finally, she looked up at Chloe,
Miss Parker, did you submit a relinquishment form to the county clerk's office?
Chloe's jaw tightened. I was advised by my previous counsel that it was necessary. That's not what I asked, the judge said sharply. Did you submit a form with a signature you knew was not authentic? Chloe hesitated, her confidence cracking. I believed it to be valid. Believed or insured? Judge Ramirez's tone was ice. Chloe didn't answer. The judge leaned back in her chair, removing her glasses. Miss Parker, this court does not take kindly to fraud, and based on the evidence presented here today, it is clear that the transfer of property was not only incomplete, but criminally falsified. She looked at Margaret, her expression softening slightly. Miss Harrington, the property in question remains legally yours. The so-called transfer is null and void. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but she held them back. Judge Ramirez continued, Furthermore, I am ordering Miss Parker to vacate the property within 14 days. Any belongings of the late Daniel Harrington will be released to Miss Harrington as next of kin. Miss Parker, you are also barred from any further claims to the estate. Chloe's face went pale. Additionally, the judge said, her voice firm, I am referring this case to the district attorney's office for investigation into potential fraud and forgery charges. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Court adjourned. Margaret sat frozen, unable to fully process what had just happened. It was over. She had won. Thomas placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Congratulations, Margaret. She turned to him, tears finally spilling over. Thank you. Thank you so much. Across the room, Chloe stood stiffly, her lawyer murmuring urgently in her ear. But she didn't look at Margaret. She didn't say a word. She simply walked out, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. And as the courtroom emptied, Margaret remained seated, staring at the judge's bench, letting the weight of it all finally sink in. Her home was hers again. Her life was hers again. Justice, slow and painful as it was, had finally arrived. The first thing Margaret did when she returned home was sit on the porch. Not to clean, not to fix anything, not to reclaim or reorganize, just to sit. The late afternoon sun bathed the front yard in gold, the same way it had the day she and Robert first stood on this land and imagined a future. Margaret closed her eyes and let the warmth wash over her. She had won the legal battle. The house was hers. Chloe was gone. But the victory felt bittersweet because Daniel was still gone, and no courtroom ruling could bring him back. In the weeks that followed, Margaret slowly began to rebuild, not the house, but herself. She repainted the living room walls the soft yellow she had always loved. She brought back the photos of Robert and Daniel, arranging them carefully on the mantel. She even found a carpenter who could replicate the rocking chair Chloe had sold, and she placed it back in its corner by the fireplace. Little by little, the home began to feel like hers again. But there was one room she couldn't bring herself to touch. Daniel's childhood bedroom. It had remained mostly untouched over the years, a time capsule of toy trucks, old books, and faded posters. After he moved out, Margaret had kept it just the way he'd left it, unable to let go of the boy he once was. Now, standing in the doorway, she realized it was time, not to erase him, but to honor him. She spent an entire Saturday transforming the room into a quiet memorial. She kept his favorite books on the shelf, along with photos of him at different ages, laughing, playing, growing. She framed his college diploma and hung it beside a drawing he had made for her when he was 7, a crooked house with a smiling sun and the words, "Me and Mom," scrawled at the bottom. When she finished, she sat on the edge of the bed and cried, not out of sadness, but release. "I did it, sweetheart. I kept your home safe." Spring came slowly that year. Margaret planted flowers in the garden, daffodils, tulips, the same ones Robert used to grow. She fixed the back porch railing, the one Chloe had wanted to tear down. She even invited her old friends over for tea, something she hadn't done in years. Life, slowly but surely, began to feel like life again. And then, one quiet afternoon in May, the doorbell rang. Margaret set down her watering can and walked to the front door, wiping her hands on her apron. When she opened it, her breath caught. Chloe stood on the porch. She looked different, smaller somehow. Her clothes were simpler, less polished. Her makeup was minimal. And her eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, looked tired, almost hollow. "Margaret," she said softly. Margaret didn't speak. She simply waited. "I know I have no right to be here, and I know you probably never want to see me again, but I needed to come. I needed to—" She trailed off, her gaze dropping to the ground. "I needed to apologize." Margaret's expression didn't change. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her face unreadable. Chloe took a shaky breath. "I was awful to you. I know that. I was selfish and cruel, and I took advantage of your kindness. I convinced myself that I deserved this house because Daniel was my husband and that somehow that made it mine. But it didn't." She looked up, tears brimming in her eyes. "Daniel loved you more than anything, and I was so jealous of that. I wanted him to love me the way he loved you. And when he didn't, or when I thought he didn't, I blamed you for it." Margaret remained silent. Chloe wiped at her eyes, her voice breaking. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I needed you to know that I'm sorry for everything." The silence stretched between them, heavy and fragile. Finally, Margaret spoke. "Chloe, do you know why Robert and I built this house?" Chloe blinked, confused. "No." "We built it because we wanted a place where love could grow, where family could feel safe, where people could come home and know they belonged." Margaret's voice was soft but firm. "But love isn't something you can take. It's something you give. And you forgot that." Chloe's face crumpled. "You're right. I forgot everything that mattered." Margaret studied the young woman in front of her, broken, humbled, lost. And despite everything, she felt something unexpected. Pity. "I hope you find your way, Chloe. I really do, but you won't find it here." Chloe nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand." She turned to leave, then paused, glancing back one last time. "For what it's worth," she said softly, "Daniel was lucky to have you." And then she was gone. Margaret closed the door and stood in the hallway for a long moment, letting out a slow, steady breath. She didn't feel anger.
She didn't feel triumph. She felt peace. That evening, Margaret sat on the porch once more, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of pink and gold, and the air smelled of fresh grass and blooming flowers. She thought of Robert, of Daniel, of all the years she had spent building this life, protecting this home, holding on to what mattered. And she smiled, not because she had won, but because she had survived, because she had fought for what was hers, not with bitterness, but with quiet strength. And now, at last, she was home. Margaret's story is one we've all felt echoes of. The pain of being underestimated, the heartbreak of betrayal, the quiet strength it takes to stand up for what's yours. But more than that, it's a reminder. Kindness is not weakness. Silence is not surrender. And patience, when paired with wisdom, is one of the most powerful forces in the world. This house taught Margaret who she was, and in the end, it taught Chloe too. Because some foundations can't be shaken, some legacies can't be stolen, and some women, they're stronger than anyone ever gave them credit for.